Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I guess islands are popular, and I think they always have been for a long time. And they often help clarify patterns. They're usually distinctly different, so we get insight from them, much more so than often the mainland. It's been said that there really are two fundamental challenges facing us with regard to knowledge of biodiversity. And the first is referred to as the Linnaean shortfall, after Carl Linnaeus. And that is we simply don't even know how many species we have and their relationship to each other. But the second one is the Wallacean shortfall, and that is we still lack knowledge on their distribution of the species, which inherently we need to know if we are going to manage these systems. Now, related to some of that, perhaps the most popular component of kind of islands and theory is MacArthur and Wilson's island biogeography, the theory of island biogeography. And conceptually, it's relatively simple from the standpoint we have situations where we may have islands that are either closer to the mainland or further apart, further away. And this ultimately is going to affect our colonization processes, our immigration. Further away it is, the less likely we have the immigration rates are lower. So these lines represent different rates. And here you have really high immigration rates when you're right next to a big patch of a source, a mainland. So that makes sense. Now, the other side of the equation is the size of the patch or the island itself. And the smaller the island, the more likely you have small populations. And small populations are going to go through different demographic or stochastic events and ultimately will be reduced in size. If you're already starting out to be small to begin with, you're more likely to have local extirpation. Now, not only will you have larger populations on a larger parcel or island, but you're also likely to have more heterogeneity and more habitats and things like that. So when you take these different rates, so here we have a really high extinction rate because we have a small island. And here we're not thinking extinction of the species itself, we're thinking extirpation from the site or the island. And here we have a situation where you're near the mainland. Eventually these islands are going to reach some sort of quasi-equilibrium where eventually the rates of immigration and colonization will reach some rates of extinction and you'll have some some species richness. So that's generally the concept of island biogeography. Now, when this was first proposed, I think MacArthur and Wilson weren't thinking of it from a conservation standpoint. They were interested in the dynamics and ecology and diversity of life and explaining patterns. And Robert MacArthur was one of his favorite topics. He always wanted to be a geographical ecologist, but he felt that that's too hard, actually, to deal with space and understanding pattern. So he very much more concentrated often on population processes as well. But if you take some of these same concepts, like small and fragmented and isolated, we use those same kind of concepts in conservation planning. And we say, well, gee, it'd be great if we're going to protect a piece of land to be big, to be large, to be unfragmented, to have corridors or stepping stones. So this really did guide a lot of the ideas around present-day conservation. And back a few decades ago, it also, especially in the early 80s, was a source of debate on one of the debates called SLOS. It's either single large or several small reserves. And if all things else being equal, which it never is, so it's kind of like a false argument to begin with, but let's pretend everything else was equal, and you had one big parcel versus 4, but they all added up to the same size. Well, one group would say, well, we could even use those theories of island biogeography. We could say, well, if you're large, you're more likely to contain viable populations because your populations are going to be bigger to begin with. And you're more likely to have intact communities or habitats within that parcel. But the other group said, well, geez, island biogeography does not first of all, island biogeography is a neutral model in biodiversity. It makes no assumptions on niches. It just says all species are eventually going to equilibrate at some equilibrium. I don't care what the niches are. So we refer to that as a neutral model. Now, the island biogeography doesn't say that these parcels have to be a subset of this large chunk. So theoretically, you could have different kind of habitats, and you could actually have more species in here than you could have there. And large, well, certainly for large mammals and birds and things like that, something large definitely has to be large. But for a lot of the biota, it doesn't necessarily have to be large to sustain something. And the other possible benefit of having fragmented parcels is you spread the risk of invasion, disease, exotics, all these other things. You have barriers now to restrict flow where you have problems. So you kind of have a portfolio effect where you have your different options and maybe something doesn't go well, but hopefully your other parcels are doing fine. Well, how does this work? The Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project, Lovejoy and others started in the late 70s. They took advantage of some clearing, and they ensured that they would leave little parcels or patches. And they left little 1 hectare patches, 10 hectare patches, and 100 hectare patch, and then they had some out in the back out into the so-called intact areas. And they looked at over time, in this case for things that are sensitive to area, what was the probability or time to extirpation or extinction in that patch for different birds. And time to extinction here was really long, obviously if you're in a really big patch. Okay, so that makes sense. So that's not surprising. Now, interestingly, although they spoke of this as kind of a forest fragments project, assuming that fragmentation was something they were looking at, they actually were looking at habitat loss. There's a difference. So with habitat fragmentation, we need to have a whole bunch of these parcels to sum up to that same parcel here. So in reality, they weren't actually looking at fragmentation. Fragmentation was a result of habitat loss. But really what they're telling us here is smaller areas have less species, or they're more likely. So in essence, they really didn't address some of that. Now, Jacobi and Rosenzweig and a few others were looking at some patches of habitat in Israel surrounded by agriculture, Mediterranean scrub habitats. And they studied 25 different patches. And what was unique about this is that 15 of them, the 15 largest, represent what's called a special patch set. And that is the very largest patch, which was 3.8 hectares, by the way, not very big. The next 2 largest summed up to 3.8, just by chance. The next 4 actually summed up back to the largest patch, and so on. So now you're controlling for area, habitat loss, but you have a lot more edge, a lot more boundary or fragmentation. And so the question is, would you still see some effects on biodiversity with the consequences of that? And if we were to see that fragmentation was having a major effect, now first of all, they looked at beetles and plants, so definitely not area-sensitive species like birds and big mammals and things like that. But if fragmentation was an issue, the largest patch should have had the highest species diversity. And in fact, in some instances, for the ground beetles, the largest diversity in alpha richness was actually in the most fragmented patches that were 8 little tiny parcels. Well, they probably represented different environments and so on, so that makes sense as well. Now, what they also did is they also looked at the total diversity here and on each of those individual patches and did a species accumulation or species area curve. And this line here from the fragmented patches, if you extend it, if there was no fragmentation effect, that point should be on the line, which they approximately are. So their conclusion was, at least for this group, that that fragmentation isn't that big a deal. Matter of fact, if you would go back to the old debate of sloths, you'd take the several small. and try to represent a diversity of habitats as much as you can. Okay, so now what happens when we have isolates or patches that are highly dynamic with disturbance? And that's something I've been interested in. If you think of the dynamic equilibrium model, which is kind of an extension to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis would say you have R and K selected species, and you have some frequency of disturbance, and maybe somewhere in between, you'd have an overlap of R and K species, and that would sum up to more species. But if you consider the fact that it depends on the type of environment you're in, the rate of population growth or competitive displacement, the productivity of that ecosystem, that determines how fast of a disturbance regime you need to maximize both R and K species overlapping. So it isn't just a matter of something in between for disturbances. You have to consider the productivity. And this zone here is the highest diversity. So in very low productivity environments, actually you want a very low frequency of disturbance to maximize diversity of R and K species. Now, David Wardle and others in Sweden have been examining kind of island biodiversity concepts in the boreal for the last, I think, about 20 years or more. And the really neat thing about their study is that, first of all, they studied islands that were as small as less than 0.1 hectare, to the largest island they studied was only about 10 hectares in size. So really small to begin with. And what they found was kind of the paradox of island size. The smaller you are, the higher your diversity. So the exact opposite of maybe what you'd think on some of our original island biogeography. Well, if you're small, you must have a lot of extirpation, not that large a population size, smaller area of habitat and number of habitats, those kind of things. But this is on a per plot basis. This isn't an inventory of the island. This is just saying that if you take 10 square meters or 100 square meters and you randomly place it on an island, and it's a bigger island versus smaller island, if the larger islands have higher diversity, on average you will show a higher diversity. You're not doing the species accumulation curve for the entire island. And biomass, by the way, was higher in the smaller islands. Well, why is this? Well, one thing is that fire frequency is larger or higher fire frequency on larger islands. So they're getting hit quite a bit. And if they're already in a low productivity type of environment, then we'd start to suggest that that would be moving it in a direction that's maybe more RK and reducing diversity overall. So we see these kind of patterns. Well, that's pretty interesting. And when I saw that, the other thing I really thought was interesting was their fire regimes that they estimated were about 1,700 years on the smallest islands, which probably about like that, and about 375 on the largest islands. Well, that got me thinking that that's nothing compared to Canada, because we have areas that burn a lot more frequent than that from a frequency standpoint. So this is from Stocks et al. In 2002, and each of these polygons represent ecoregions of Canada and the percent annual area burned. And you can take that as a crude approximation. The inverse of that would be the fire return interval. So a 1% burn per year would average a 100-year fire return interval as a rough rule, just on any random chance. But we have upwards of 1.5% per year being burned. That's a 66-year interval. Well, I want to go to that spot. I want to go to a spot that is as dynamic as possible, because if I know small islands aren't going to burn, I would get a really dramatic difference between disturbance regimes on larger islands. And we're assuming the larger islands, again, are started by fire, and lightning is more likely on a large island, and then it spreads from there. And it turns out the Athabasca Sand Plain is one of the two kind of hot spots of fire frequencies in Canada. Well, broad?
Average.
All right.
And within that area, there are going to be areas where the the percent annual burn is about 3%.
Oh, okay. If you go to a certain...
Yeah, if you go to a smaller size. So that's the average over a large...
Pretty big area.
Region,
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing we did is, I was thinking that, well, okay, now we have water, these kind of areas. Well, in general, Alberta doesn't have a lot of it. We don't really have the Canadian Shield except in the far northeast. I kind of grew up on the Canadian Shield even though I was in the U.S. I like the Canadian Shield, so I like to go there to do things. And so I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to address an interesting question. And with a student, Krista Reinhardt, is she here today? Yeah, back there. So one of the things we did with Mark Persian, who's helping as well now. Where did Mark end up? Over there. We were trying to look at kind of fire refugia and lake shadow effects. So if it works on islands, it should be able to work in any place where you just have a lot of water and so on. So if you just take all the fire polygon data for an area like 1950 to 2010 for all of the boreal of this zone from here down to there for 50 years or so, and you look at where it burned, the polygons weren't drawn perfectly, but on average, matter of fact, they're probably more likely to draw it along the lakeshore than not. But we were interested in, are there these shadows or these barriers or refugia around complicated landscape configurations drawn by water that influence the variability in stand ages, which would create the heterogeneity in biodiversity. So this is a model that represents the probability, a preliminary model, the probability of fire, in this case occurring over 50 years, because we just used the entire 50-year period. Kind of a little bit hard. This is L'Orange Lake. Canadian Shield ends right here. You can see some of these islands and some of these areas, peninsula, are kind of more green. And that is, they have a much lower probability of burning. So theoretically, the fire return interval will be a lot longer. And this is what if you looked at not only the location relative to the lake, but the amount of water. Well, of course, if you just have a little tiny pond, that's not going to stop a boreal fire. So you need to know the kind of extent of water. And of course, if you have a lot of water within 1,000 hectares, your probability of burning is really low. So, well, that makes sense as well. But the interesting thing is trying to map it to look at where there are special places that might be of interest. So again, kind of those examples. And if you take the Athabasca sand plain, which is this blue line, this is the two dimensions of isolation and portion water. So they both are kind of fairly similar things. This red area is high probability of fire, very low probability of fire. So we're really close to water. And of course, you have a lot of water. Of course, you're not going to really burn. So, or at least as frequently. And so that showed promise. Now, if we go to island-based systems, a place like Cree Lake is on the Athabasca sand plain. So it has a common substrate. It's actually a sandstone, a Precambrian sandstone that was laid down 1.1 billion years ago. There's only a couple Precambrian sandstones in the world. This is one of them. And this was the original erosion of the orogeny which arise the mountains off the Canadian Shield towards Reindeer Lake. And eventually those granitoids eroded down into a plain, which was the Athabasca sand plain. And this sand plain, low nutrients, sure it has the normal precipitation and everything else, but being sand, the moisture availability is quite low. And you can just see, you just open up Google Earth or Google Maps, and you definitely see things just burning all over the place here or there. It has 706 islands, and so it's a perfect natural laboratory to examine these things. And this would be in 2010 when we went there shortly after a fire, some of the islands and some of the jack pine stands that were burned. But this is the thing that I was interested in. This is a Spatnow Island, which is the largest island, about 5,000 hectares in size. But right next to it, you'll always get these little tiny islands that completely forested and obviously aren't burnt. What's the chance that ember or alternately lightning is going to strike it? Not very good. So that's consistent with what the folks in Sweden were saying. Cree Lake's large lake, 12,000 hectares, 706 islands ranging from, well, this is the resolution of the map, 0.02 hectares to a little over 5,000 hectares, which is the Spatnau Island, largest one, which is this island right there. And this is the size class distribution on a log scale. Of course, you have a lot of the small stuff and very few of these really big islands. So that makes sense. Now, interestingly, the scale in general is it's scale invariant. That is, the perimeter area, the shapes of these things, anywhere over about 0.5 hectares is common. So the kind of design of the island, you're just changing size, not so much the perimeter area kind of relationship. And you can tell that when you have a straight line and a log-log graph on perimeter to size. So Kating Chen, where's Kating? She make it? So as an undergrad, she also was helping out, and we went through 28 years. She went through 28 years of Landsat 5 and Landsat 7 data from 1984 to 2011. And for each island, all 706 islands, kind of zoomed in at a consistent scale, we looked at each year to indicate whether the entire island burned or the amount of the island that burned. And this, for instance, it might be a bit hard to see, but that's an active fire burning in that Landsat image on Cree Lake. You can just barely see the smoke and the red. Now, these are the islands with the number of fires now over that 28 years. We have a Spatnau Island in 28 years that had 6 fires. The whole thing didn't burn down every time. It got large enough, the island's large enough that only portions of the island burned. But we're going to address that in a few minutes. So we have a data set now that tells us which islands were burned or not. We've done a whole bunch of GIS work to try measure isolation. Area is simple to measure. In general, people, instead of using distance to things, people have found that buffered proportions work a lot better. So if you take these big buffers, I started out small at 100 meters and went up to 10,000 meters around each island. And around each island, so there's 706 of these, but then redone at each of those scales. This is 10 kilometers. Around each island, I just summed up, well, what is the amount of water? That's going to give me a pretty good idea of isolation from some other land or mainland source of terrestrial source. And I didn't talk about it from that prior, that other work, but if winds always come from the west, and if you have a wind and it's going to burn in a fire, it's going to move east. So if you are on the west side of the lake, you're more likely to have embers and other things coming in. The east side should have a better fire shadow or refugia. So just taking aspect from the center to wherever you are in the lake basin, I can say, well, you're more west, you're more east, and that should influence, if I put this into a west index, of whether that matters or not. But because we have a time series, some years are more conducive to burning than others. And to address that, we used Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the El Nino Index for each of these 28-year periods, here and here. And specifically, we used the winter El Nino, which tends to be a little bit more influential in this part of the world, and the spring PDO, spring and winter PDO are both fairly influential, especially in the Rocky Mountains. It starts to die out by the time you get to Saskatchewan, but we tried it anyway. And I should say there's a lag effect for, we tried 1 year lag effects, the year prior. Now, I'm interested in modeling the fire regimes on these islands so I can then understand biodiversity or test some theories. So I used a 2-stage approach, and the first is what is the probability that an island will burn, but not necessarily the whole thing, because we have the problem with the Spatnau Island and the big ones that only part of it burned. So after that, I want to say, well, what was the proportion of that island burned? So what I used is a cross-sectional time series type of analysis, a logistic regression analysis, to look at the presence-absence of fire per year per island. And then I use a random effect for island to account for that correlation in the data. And there's 706 panels or groups which represent our islands. There was 28 years, so there was 19,000 768 observations. And then the second step is, given that a conditional probability, given that it did burn, how much of the island burned? So there, use a cross-sectional time series because we had some islands reburning. A generalized linear cross-sectional time series model. But I converted the proportion burned to a logit just to ensure I never predicted greater probabilities proportions more than 1 or less than 0. So it's just a trick we can do. And then you can back transform that to get your proportions again. Random effect again. So the first one, the stage 1 model, we have island size, isolation, west index, the multivariate El Nino index, winter, PDO, spring, and the prior year's PDO spring. And influencing and predicting the probability that islands will burn. Well, of course, if you're larger, we kind of already know that. You're more likely to burn. If you're more isolated, you're less likely to have a fire. If you have a west orientation, sure enough, it's marginal, but you're a little bit more likely to burn on the west side of Cree Lake than on the east side. More likely after an El Nino winter, less likely after cool springs and the prior year's cool spring conditions. And a constant, which is just the average probability, is pretty low. So this is putting those probabilities back on the islands. So I want to track the islands. And here we have Spatno, the largest one, reaching 0.164 probability. So the inverse of that is, I don't remember off the top of my head, but fire return interval like 13 years or even less. 8, 9, 13, somewhere in there. But remember, it's not all of the island, so we have to correct for that. But you will notice that all these little islands have very low probabilities. So they are in the hundreds and thousands of years on average that we expect them to burn, even though we're only using the last 28 years of data. And we're interested in that because eventually if you take fire history not just for 50 years or 28 years, but you go back since glaciation and you run this game out for 10,000 years, where you have some islands not burning very much and others that are, you're changing soils and other ecological processes to get almost completely different stable states. Now the proportion burned, sure enough, if you're small, you're just going to burn the whole thing. If you get really big, only a certain amount of Spatno Island, for instance, is going to burn. There's a couple wetlands and there are a couple barriers. So island size matters. You're less likely to have all of it burn if you're a large island. More of the island will burn if you're isolated. Less of the island burned if you had wetlands present, a barrier. And then it starts looking like this. So if a fire does happen on this island, it's pretty much going to toast the whole thing. Here, no. Okay, so now we have both of these. We have a two-stage model, and we can combine those. At least I combine them. I don't know if it's exactly right, but this is what I thought. The fire return interval would be 1 over the probability of fire, that conditioned on the proportion that you actually burned. So if it's 100% of the island would burn, and you have a probability of 0.5 of burning, well then it's still 0.5. We can take the inverse of that and get a fire return interval. So then if we remap these, it would come back to this, where the red islands now have the lowest fire return interval. It turns out that the very largest islands, you're just starting to get large enough that maybe they had a couple wetlands and other things that you brought that fire return interval on any one patch of ground a little bit down. Okay? So maximum fire return interval is in the 200 to 2,000 hectare. Now remember, Wardle and those guys were looking at 0.1, less than 0.1 to 10 hectares in size. That was their system they were working in.
Do you have any estimate of the surrounding mainland fire return interval?
No. Would have been good to get, but we didn't. We definitely didn't get that. So, but it is. I should say that. I wonder if we can see in a few photos back. Probably too far back. I'm not going to go all the way back. But the north end. It turns out that the Athabasca Plain actually starts right here. there's hardly any inlets to this lake. It's strange. The Cree River runs to near Black Lake and down to Fond du Lac and so on. But this thing is just full of springs. It's just quite remarkable. It's very well known for lake trout and so on. But this side is all burning all the time. So you look at any image and it looks almost like a parking lot. It's just kind of white. This is getting hitting over and over and over again. So the fire return interval there has to be, well, I'm assuming it's higher. All right, so what does this mean for biodiversity? Well, if we, we'll just do that there. If we then take, I'm just going to assume that there are some taxonomic groups or species that may have some immigration or colonization problems. But in general, we're not talking tens and hundreds of kilometers away from a mainland source. So I'm just going to pretend we're going to keep that constant, a constant immigration rate. Now, if we have small islands to large islands, we actually say, well, if you're small, you're going down in diversity. But now we're going to say, hold on. We might have a compensating effect of the fact that extinction processes can also happen from repeated disturbances. So now, this could actually be some of the larger islands that have the highest extinction rates, which may explain why those smaller or the larger islands now, not the small islands, they're this way on the species richness gradient, just shown there. And conversely, the small islands rather than the large islands are shifting a bit that way. So that might be one conceptual approach to still using island biogeography principles, but shifting it in the direction that's kind of opposite to what its original predictions would have been. So what did we do? In 2010, James Glacier, myself and a few other people flew in there on a float plane, and James collected ants in a 1,000 square meter plot, and we did nested plant diversity surveys in 1 meter square, 10 meter square, and then the summed up into 100 meter square. And we did that on 41 islands over about a little more than 2-week period. So just some general patterns. This is island size, and this is the canopy, proportion tree canopy. So we have over 50% canopy and even close to 100% canopy only when you're really small. So again, yeah, you're not burning very much, but by the time you get to 100 hectares or so, you're definitely more in this lichen woodland type of situation. And conversely, you're crawling through the craziest stuff on the smallest island. Now, if we just look at a couple example species, black spruce are what you find on those small islands. In general, their abundance decreases as island size increases, down to the point where you get to about 1,000. The very largest islands, it tends to be a little bit less common. But that was our plots. If you went to all the sites, this thing would shift up a bit. Jack pine, you wouldn't find until you were actually about a 10-hectare island. And things like paper birch, again, you know, the 50 hectares or thereabouts. If you're over that, you won't find paper birch. Betula piperifera. Now, if you look at some of the ground layer data, first the bryophytes, and this is richness, species richness, and this is cover, abundance in cover. And this is lichens. So we have completely different patterns between the two. Where you don't have the fire and you have the small islands, of course, you're going to shift to the bryophyte. And where you have a tremendous amount of fire, you're going to shift an increased diversity of lichens, increase cover of lichens, but decrease cover of bryophytes and diversity of bryophytes. And this is an example of some of these small islands. Regardless, nothing is diverse there, at least of the things that we were looking at. It's feather moss and black spruce and a few other things you bump into. And that's the small islands. So even those aren't necessarily, they're not speciose by any stretch of the imagination. And then when you get to those larger islands, 50 hectares, definitely 100 hectares or larger, you start getting these kind of lichen woodland situations, which you could walk on the island all day long, and you will not bump into an Asteraceae, a grass. You will find grass growing on the beach. That is it. The second you get on the island, you can spend all day long, and you have these complete functional groups or legumes, things like that, totally missing. Now the vascular plants and James's ants, the ants do increase, though there's a box plot, it comes down a bit on the largest islands. Smallest islands actually have a low diversity of ants on a single plot. Plants, there wasn't really much variation. There's a cover generally was highest in the small, moderate size islands. But certainly vegetation, the vascular plants, I should say, were not responding to the extinction type events by having more and more, or we've already gone through that process through these repeated fires over and over again. Hence, we have such a depaupered ecosystem to begin with, or at least that we're viewing now. So let's test a few hypotheses. We'll test the island biogeography hypothesis using isolation and island size. We're going to test just, well, we think fire is a major driver of diversity in the boreal. Let's use fire return interval that we spent a lot of time calculating. Let's use the intermediate disturbance hypothesis by saying, well, somewhere in between the fire return interval, so a quadratic, nonlinear shape, and we might as well test some things like heterogeneity in the environment, like terrain variability and canopy or canopy, nonlinear canopy, since sunlight and things like that are going to definitely drive a lot of this. So we have our different groups here, taxonomic groups, and these are aka weights of the probability that that model is supported given the data and the models examined. So here we have vascular plants, and I've tried to bold, it might be a little bit hard to see, but actually this is pretty weak, but there's just a slight bump up on the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. It's not that different, however, from the environmental heterogeneity. So both of them are roughly 0.25 probability of being right out of the others, but not much support for some of those others. Bryophytes were very much driven by the island biogeography principles. Isolation actually was playing more of a role in bryophytes, believe it or not, than any of the others. And then the size was also important. Lichens, here the fire interval was really important. If you don't have that frequent enough fire interval, you're going to shift towards bryophytes anyway, so you can't have much diversity in lichens. And ants, ants were very much more habitat driven. You could take habitat canopy, or you could actually take diversity of vascular plants and get a fairly similar support. So actually the habitats themselves tell you very much what the ants were using. Now the moderate to small size islands are my favorite, and that's the spot where you start getting birch, and we'd have to sample those much more intensely to get the semi-rare species enough to say much about it. But things that like Cypridium, the orchids, pink lady slipper orchids, things like that, you will only find on these size class islands. If you get too small, it's just bryophytes and everything else. The orchid's not going to do very good there. Too large, it's the competition with lichens and the fires are going to drive that to local extinction. So these different configurations and the small islands have certain communities. There's definitely patterns here, even after 41 plots. The lichen-dominated communities are mainly the Cladina stellaris and the Rangeolifera, the reindeer lichen and those type of things. And the bryophytes, which Richard ID'd for me. Thank you. And the large islands are burning all the time, so some of the things I just wanted everything to be random. I didn't want to know if it burned or not. We went there, sure enough. Most of our islands we went to burned, and so we were doing plots, on looking at some of the burned sites. So some of the things as some conclusions is the first thing is I like this concept of dark diversity. I don't care about dark energy or dark whatever they talk about, but dark diversity is really interesting. And that is, why don't we even have things like legumes and grasses and forbs and Asteraceae and things that are common to almost every terrestrial ecosystem in North America on these areas. We span a huge fire gradient from 5,000 year estimated fire interval to 60 year or 30 year fire interval. You'd think somewhere in there it could do fine. As perenniating organisms, or the perenniating parts are below ground, so fire goes through, it's not a big deal. It should be able to come right back up. And so fire alone can't explain the dark diversity, why we're missing so many things. But maybe interference competition with lichens, allelopathy, or just even physical, structural. No matter what, the survivors that have been able to persist long-term in this system have very specific life history traits. So I'm thinking of vascular plants in this specific situation. So they tend to be asexually reproducing species, the Ericaceae, things like that. So if you're asexually reproducing and you were able to establish, you're not going to have as big an issue over the long term, presumably. And if you take Houston's dynamic equilibrium, very much a high fire return interval, and at least this type of site you're looking at here, which is above where you could sustain both a coexistence of an R and K, mostly because you're at such low productivities to begin with that any type of fire regime is probably going to be sensitive to community composition and diversity. So Houston also didn't just consider more of that intermediate disturbance hypothesis and productivity gradient, but also the landscape processes that allow source sink rescue effects. And even if you have a disturbance, you should be able to have populations elsewhere that rescue it from local extirpation. But apparently we lack even that pool, those sources to begin with, which I find pretty interesting. So just a last slide. Some of the things we're interested in is, I wanted to do it, but I didn't have a chance for today, is look at the beta diversity, which can tell us a lot more about those small to moderate-sized islands. So even though on average they may have somewhat low diversity, if you went to the next one, there'd be a lot of turnover. It'd be a different composition of species. And the sum of that would tell us that, oh, by the way, you can actually the moderate and small size islands really are important for diversity, but having a lot of them. Kind of like going back to the sloths debate of having a lot of small ones that have a lot of variability that can sum up to greater diversity. So one of the things I've always been interested in is serotiny patterns in jack pine. I'm originally from Wisconsin, and Radeloff from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Northwest Pine Barrens of jack pine showed that you can go 10 kilometers and go from 10% serotiny to 100% serotiny. And that is a long-term indicator to me of long-term fire pressure on selecting for certain traits. Because if you have low-intensity frequent fires, you're going to reduce your serotiny levels to ensure that your seed source can repopulate these sites. We didn't see that much difference in the serotiny patterns when we were there. Collected cones. We collected some lichens and wanting to do some allelopathy and germination experiments. Why not, if the species pool is missing, why not add it experimentally? And why not do knockout experiments if this lichen stuff is just so dominant? The obvious thing to do is get rid of it and test to see whether, if you get rid of it without adding some propagules to it, will you see things come up? Probably not, but you should verify that. And since the system is so nutrient deficient, adding, let's say, nitrogen or something, and combinations of these would, I think, be pretty interesting. So I'd like to thank the people. I've received exactly $0 for this funding, but as you can tell, I'm a bit passionate about it, so I've made it do. And we've had a team who have volunteered, from undergraduates to other people who have helped out. And I'd like to give all of those people a round of applause for helping out.